Chairman, dear colleagues, dear friends, beste Vrienden. Welcome to the Museum of the Zoological Institute of the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. So this is a museum, as you notice, and this is the University of Leuven, and we welcome you there very much. But today is a very special day, and it was told exactly 200 years ago, Charles Robert Darwin, was born in the market city of Shrewsbury. And Shrewsbury is Shropshire, which is on the border of Wales and England. He grew up in a well-to-do family. His father was a doctor. He was always interested in natural life, although he was a moderate student. He studied in his 20s, first medicine in Edinburgh, and then he moved on to study theology in Cambridge, so to become a minister in the Anglican Church. Actually, his father wished him to be a doctor. After that, when he saw he was not that interested, he moved him into theology, but his really desire to look at the natural history of his environment, that's what he wanted to do. So he opted finally for his first love, natural history. And he would become a lifelong student of natural history, being an independently wealthy researcher. There are few of us like that. There are still few of us like that, but he could do that. So he decided on his own program, free from sorrows, for example, of academic and government dictations or directions, or sorrows which were related to paperwork and so on. He could just do what he wanted. So at the age of 22 to 27, he embarked on a big cruise, on a big expedition on the sailing ship, the Beagle. And that would, for him, be really a direction in his future research and the ideas he would develop. He would go on an expedition basically around South America and then into the Pacific, and returning through Cape Hope into the Atlantic. And during that time, he observed very carefully the natural history, as well on land as in the ocean. And he stopped by in some interesting islands, such as the Galapagos. We know that for Darwin's finches, for example, Australia and Mauritius. Now, important to know is that Charles lived during a period that people gradually realized that life was not really created by God, nor that it remained always the same, so that it was static. So Darwin, but he feared that when he expressed his ideas, he would at that time, of course, go against the current grain, the current order. And thus Charles kept on searching for evidence. He was one of those people who kept on looking for evidence and would maybe publish it even not at all at the end and take it with him to his grave. But this didn't happen. He prepared meticulously a manuscript, but awaited publication till he would have the final evidence. But then appeared another person, Russell Wallace. He was less academic in his interests, but he had a good field evidence. He worked mostly from out of the Indonesian archipelago, and he was a collector for a lot of people here in Western Europe. So he also came to the idea of change through selection. And this is the key idea. Things change, but they change gradually. And it's only sort of the survival of the fittest. It's not mentioned yet, but it's this idea which is there. So this put some pressure on Charles Darwin. Shall I or shall I not? Well, ultimately an agreement was made, and formally they presented both their findings at the Royal Society in London in 1859. So that's at his age of 50 years, and that's now 150 years ago. And Darwin at the same time felt so much the pressure that he published his manuscript, which is entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So the selection component is the key thing. Now, at that time, and now I come here to this area, here in Belgium, Prof. Pierre-Joseph van Beneden was a highly esteemed and very successful professor of zoology here. Working and living exactly in this building, King's College, we call it, or the Zoological Institute. He was particularly fascinated by marine life and founded with his own funds the first marine biological station in Europe. It doesn't exist anymore, but he was the first one to put one up in Ostend. He published prodigally a lot of papers and made numerous collections of animals worldwide to stock his museum, this museum. And one of those animals, if you look up, you see a whale. This is his whale, a right whale he bought, which was shot or collected. At that time they were not shot, they were harpooned in the North Atlantic, which was brought into Iceland. There the flesh was taken off and the bones were shipped to here on his initiative. He was a specialist in whales, and this is one of his models because a lot more are in Brussels. At the other side, he was a fixist. He believed things were created at one moment and stayed like that. That's the same time as Darwin. So you see people with different ideas were still looking at science, doing their research. So now back to Darwin and his ideas. It was only the son of Professor van Beneden. His son is Edouard van Beneden, and to a certain degree he was the antithesis of his father. He was the person who picked up, for example, the ideas of Darwin. He took notice of them. He became a strong supporter of evolution, such that he directed indeed some of his research. He was mostly interested in embryology, the study of embryos and how they develop. So, but when you look at the context, his son was working, Edouard, at the end of the century. It was quite a lukewarm reception of Darwin's ideas. His book had sold very well in London, in the Anglo-Saxon world, but on the continent, where Belgium was sort of floating between France and Germany, it was a bit lukewarm. Actually, here in Leuven, there was a very strong supporter, and he's just around the corner. 2 houses further on, there is house Henri de Dorlodeau. He's a geologist, he was a geologist. He built a house on his own funds. He built a museum, the Geological Museum, where I have the honor to work. And he was one of the stronger supporters of Darwin in this area. But overall, the environment was lukewarm. And just not to mention that the Catholic hierarchies in Rome were not so happy with this development. Now today, evolution through selection is firmly embedded in the theory of neo-Darwinian evolution. Now, neo-Darwinian states that you have at one side the selection component, I just explained to you, but I haven't mentioned a word about chromosomes and genes. All of you know those exist. Well, at a certain time in the middle of last century, both of those ideas were brought together. So at the moment, evolutionary biology is a central tenet of modern biology and provides an excellent scaffold for many observations, experiments, models, and theories. Moreover, these are fascinating times for evolutionary biology because many of the ideas and theories we have, they become testable these days. Why do they become testable? Because we make major technological progress. I just have to mention to this public the ways of sequencing full animals. Initially, the human genome was sequenced over 3 or 4 years with a lot of planning ahead of it. At the moment, this job would have been cleared in a few months. So I refer, one of those ideas to be tested is, for example, the implication of a steady arms race between an animal and its parasite. You know, a lot of us carry all kinds of pathogens, viruses, some ugly parasites we usually call them. But you can imagine there is a continuous contest between those. So here in our group, I take one case of a researcher, it's Professor Ellen de Castenger. She has exactly studied that. She took, as a model, not man, but she took a little flea, water flea, and the bacteria and the unicellular organisms living on it. Now, she studied this continuous arms race between both of them. And I mention it because just as the Wall Street Journal is an excellent journal in economics, she published it in the excellent Journal of Nature. And we can go on with research which is going on in this group because I notice quite a number of the researchers are standing here with you. So there are good indications that evolution is sometimes not only neo-Darwinian. So I have to bring you through ideas. The first one is selection is an important thing. The second thing I added, you have to implement genes and chromosomes. Now there is another step. For example, if you have viruses, they get into the body of an organism, but they jump out of it too. And when they jump out, they take stuff from the original body. I'm really afraid now, because this means if I get infected, and later on I infect you, you might get some of my genetic material. And before you know it, you become a little bit another person. Now we call this horizontal gene transfer. Just to mention that the ideas of Darwin are not the only ones which are working in evolution. Darwin is an important person. He set a time, but it's not the only thing. And so neo-Darwinism has to be revised partially to post-neo-Darwinism. And we are doing that as scientists. Next week we have a meeting on that on Wednesday afternoon. So, here I am at the end of my talk. I introduced you to Darwin, whom we honor today. I introduced you to this museum and its people behind it. I gave you a slight indication of the research we do here. If you want information of the KU Leuven, it's laying here in front of me. So the only thing which is left is now the very pleasant thing of toasting on Charles Darwin, who's not here, of course. He's 200 years old. You see him usually with his big beard. That's at his older age. You can see pictures when he was much younger. But I would say all toast. Cheers.